Ladies and gents, welcome to CG Reaction, and this is Miscellaneous Myths Loki by the channel Overly Sarcastic Production. What is this? I started researching this goddamn video in June of 2019. I was so young, so innocent. This video is a precious relic of the before times. Yeah, okay. Unlike those inconsiderate Vikings, I went out of my way to take actual notes. Yeah, okay. So, Loki, we are going to Norse mythology now with Loki. So far I reacted to all its Sarcastic Productions, Hindu gods, Krishna and Kali. And then I started to react to the, Greek mythology with all the Hades, Persephone and things like that, Heracles. So this time we are doing the Loki. I think Marvel's Loki is different from the actual Norse mythology, because one thing I do know of this is Loki is not son of Odin. He's somewhat brother or blood brother. I don't know, it's confusing. I don't know Norse mythology, obviously. I only know bits here and there. But yeah, obviously lots of things that we learn in the Marvel series is not going to be accurate. But yeah, I think Loki is trickster and I guess Lord of Mischief or something like that. I don't know if that's accurate or not. This video is going to be fun. I reacted to a few Overly Sarcastic Production videos already. If you haven't seen them, check out the cast. There's a playlist uploaded for it. Overly Sarcastic Production reactions, something like that. Check out the playlist too, like Salmonella, Internet Historian, I guess Tearzu, Real Life Lore, CGP, things like that. And yeah, that's what this one.
Most of us first get exposed to mythology through illustrated kids' books. This gives us the false impression that mythology is like a book, written down and not particularly prone to change. But that's more like what mythology fossilizes into over time. The actual living mythology looks very different from the carefully articulated skeletons that we—
Mythologies are not book. At that, long time ago, people didn't just wrote down books. Mythology usually it's one of those things. You know how you watch those pirate movies and there are always people just sitting in the taverns, talking about all this mythology about monsters and things. I think that's how mythology used to be, where people just talk and pass it down with each other. And that also, I guess, it started with something else, it ended up with entirely something else, because that's how it works. When you tell somebody something, they're prone to add things by their own.
We put in the museums. Mythology is stories, and stories change with every telling. If you're passing stories down generationally through folklore and oral tradition, things change a lot, especially the characters. And in mythology, the characters are gods. So the gods end up evolving alongside their society. Every time a myth of a god gets written down, it's like a photograph of that god in that single moment of their development, or like a single frame from an animation. That single frame might be very cool and interesting, but if we can find enough of those keyframes and put them in the right order, we can—
Yeah, but history books make things immortal. So basically, if something like a book is created, that's it. That's the real version from there on. That version becomes immortal, I guess.
can try and trace out what the full animation might have looked like and get a feel for how this god actually evolved over time. When we do a deep dive like this, I usually go as far back as I can to try and find the earliest stories so we can trace this evolution and watch as the gods we're familiar with now start out as wildly unfamiliar figures before growing and changing with their societies to eventually become the figure we recognize today. Which brings us to our first problem. What do we recognize as Loki these days? Sources are very contradictory. He shows up in a lot of modern stories, frequently a shapeshifter or illusionist, and usually an antagonist, but that's about the only semi-consistent quality he gets. Sometimes he's a Jotun like his father, sometimes he's a rebellious kid because Odin is his father, sometimes he's working with Odin, sometimes he's a tragic gothic prince of darkness, sometimes he's a sniveling coward, sometimes he's a full-on good guy with a tricksy streak, sometimes he's just a sassy little kid, sometimes he's literally Satan, and sometimes he's confidently described as a fire deity, even though he probably isn't, my bad. So while previous deep dives have had an easy starting point because we have a clear image of where the deity in question ends up, Loki's wildly inconsistent modern portrayal complicates the issue. We can still look back to where he started.
Yeah, Loki basically, let's just say, is complicated.
But we don't have a clear image of what he's going to become, which is just like him, honestly. He could stand to be a little more considerate about these things, but looking back to where he started isn't as easy as I made it sound. The other main complication here comes to us courtesy of Christianity, and the stubborn refusal of the Norse to actually use their existing writing system to write their mythology down before the monks showed up. Our pre-Christian sources are sparse to non-existent, and Christianity has this frustrating habit of retconning other people's religions out of existence. So inconsiderate. Won't someone think of the scholars? So instead of diving into the earliest mythology, because because we don't have any from that far back. Nobody tell Blue, but we're gonna try starting with the real history about as far back as we can go. The end of the Ice Age, when the glacial ice pack finally receded from Scandinavia and the region entered the Nordic Stone Age. This period of history is pretty solidly in the Fog of Ages zone, where basically all we know about the people who lived there is how they preferred to nap their flint. A series of Stone Age societies cycled in and out of this region from 12,000 BCE till around 2800 BCE, when the Indo-European battle axe culture broke onto the scene and hung out with the coastal pitted ware culture for 1,000 years or so until 1700 BCE, when the societies fused together and entered the Nordic Bronze Age. This new culture practiced agriculture and domesticated animals, maintained trade with our friends over in Mycenae and Greece, had a ton of wealth by the standards of the era, and were really into boats. Between all the rock carvings of ships and their boat-shaped burial monuments, we can already see how these proto-Norsemen were on track to becoming the seafaring Vikings we know and love. Now, they didn't seem to have a writing system at this point, so all the theories about their
Yeah, they were covered with sea so much that they obviously thought that this is the most dominating thing a society can do. You know, building boats. Boats are going to be everything. So obviously they revolved around that.
mythology are pretty fragmentary and not very well sourced, but we know from their art that they cared about three things: animals, boats, and the sun. They seem to have made a mythological connection between the movement of the sun and the movement of animals, and specifically they decided the sun was
early civilization of course are going to worship the sun because that's the first thing you see. This glowing thing in the sky that gives you light, gives you everything. It feels good when that's up, when that goes down, danger rises at that nights by, wolves and God knows what kind of animals that might attack you. So obviously, sun is the first thing people are going to, pray to. Like there must be a God, obviously.
Being pulled by a horse like a chariot. This is noteworthy because it actually survived into Norse mythology in the characters of Skinfaxi and Hrimfaxi, the horses that pull the chariots of the sun and moon. While plenty of mythologies conflate the sun and moon with chariots, the person in the chariot usually gets more press than the animal pulling it. Anyway, around 500 BCE, there was a bit of a technological leap and Scandinavia entered the Iron Age, working with bog iron they extracted from peat. A little bit of local climate change seems to have nudged the Norsemen a little ways south, which probably helped take them to the next big jump just around 0 CE when the Romans arrived. The transition from the pre-Roman Iron Age to the Roman Iron Age was pretty painless, since for the Scandinavians it basically just meant another trade route. The Romans gave them coins, vessels, weapons, all that good stuff. But the Romans got something very valuable for us. They actually wrote some stuff down. In roughly 98 CE, General Tacitus wrote the Germania, an ethnography of the Germanic peoples they made trade with, and noted that they seemed to worship a pantheon of gods led by Mercury, honored with animal and human sacrifices on a specific day of the week. He also mentioned worship of Mars, Hercules, and Isis. Now that classic Roman syncretism is in full swing here, but it doesn't take a comparative mythology scholar to work out that this Mercury is the tricksy traveler Odin, worshipped on Odin's Day, aka Wednesday, and that Mars and Hercules are most likely Tyr and Thor. Tyr mapped to Mars because they're both war gods, and Thor to Hercules probably because they're both giant slayers. Unfortunately, Isis could theoretically be any of the Norse goddesses, but Frigg or Freya is probably the best bet.
Roman worshipped Isis. Somebody tell Fox News.
Regardless, this is the first solid written confirmation of the Norse pantheon we know and love. It's fragmentary and filtered through a highly biased lens, but it gives us something to work with. Unfortunately, it doesn't give us Loki, and what exactly that means is a little unclear. He could have been a relatively minor figure in the pantheon, not worth
Look at the face. You didn't write down the thing with the goat, right? Shh.
Tacitus is time to mention, and since he only listed the hugely important major players with days of the week named after them, that's not too far-fetched. But it's also possible that Loki didn't exist yet. And that's weird. This is also around when the Norse writing system first appears. Futhark runes first get used around 150 CE, theoretically derived from an old Italic script, though it's not 100% clear how they got from the Italian peninsula all the way up to Scandinavia. Mythologically, Odin receives the forbidden knowledge of magic runes by ritualistically sacrificing himself to himself on Yggdrasil the World Tree and getting a sweet power-up, which I guess is as good an explanation as any. Step up your game, Duolingo. Anyway, that trade situation continues till around 400 CE when the Roman Empire accidentally plugs a power bar into itself and collapses into the ocean, and the Scandinavians basically don't notice. But they sure notice what happens next, as the 700 CE is when the monks show up. Christian missionaries roll up to Scandinavia, and the Norse hate it so much that apparently it kicks off the Viking Age in retaliation, officially
Christian monks, arrive there like, who the f*** are you? Where did the Romans go? And look over the horizon, and there's nothing but silence.
beginning in 793 when Vikings ransack and burn Lindisfarne Abbey, taking all their shinies, killing and enslaving the monks, and firmly establishing their reputation as terrifying for the next 1,000 years. The Viking Age continued for around 3 centuries, but while the Vikings were out Viking, the Christianization of Scandinavia continued behind them, and by 1100 the area was almost fully Christianized. And then, after all that, We finally get the first reference to Loki. Around 1200, Icelandic politician and historian Snorri Sturluson wrote the Prose Edda, the first written compilation of Norse mythology, apparently in service of his main political goal at the time, which was getting Iceland to unify with Norway under the rule of King Haakon IV. He didn't succeed, and Haakon had him assassinated a couple decades later, but that doesn't matter right now, because this motivation completely reframes his role in compiling the Prose Edda. Iceland and Norway were fully Christianized at this point, but by consolidating their shared pagan history and mythology, Snorri could give them a single cultural identity to promote their unification under Haakon. Sure, we're Iceland and you're Norway, but we're all Norsemen, right? Bring it in. So that's why the Prose Edda begins with a prologue describing the Christian story of Genesis and reframes the Norse gods as Trojan heroes who fled the fall of Troy, settled in Scandinavia, and were accepted as divine kings thanks to their superior technology. That's right,
Okay.
Snorri Sturluson ancient aliens himself. Anyway, with that bit of Christianity-approved justification out of the way, Snorri dives into what we hope is some proper pre-Christian mythology. And this is where we get our first look at Loki. Now, Loki pops up all over the place in the Prose Edda. He's referred to with the epithet backbiter.
Yeah, okay, so this is just, yeah. Backbiter, inventor of lies and deceit, beautiful but evil in disposition. Causes problems for the gods but helps them out too. Cunning and clever, textbook chaotic neutral. Yeah, consequences for my actions, it's more likely than you think. All his stories follow the same structure. Loki does something for shits and giggles. Unintended consequences ensue, and the Aesir forced Loki to fix it. Yeah, okay. It's basically Christian came up with the Loki, huh?
And described as fickle-minded, the inventor of lies, and beautiful but evil in disposition. So basically, classic femme fatale. He's summed up in one sentence as regularly causing problems for the Aesir, but just as regularly helping them out with his clever tricks and schemes. Basically, the token, chaotic, neutral teammate who causes problems for shits and giggles, but then cleans up his mess when he has to. He has 3 children with a giantess in Jotunheim, and he keeps them a secret from the Aesir. But they find out eventually, and unfortunately for Loki, there's a prophecy going on. These children are destined to cause some serious problems for the Aesir when Ragnarok rolls around, so Odin deals with them. Loki's daughter, Hel, is cast into Niflheim, and while she becomes the super powerful queen of the dead, it's pretty clear she can't really leave. His son, Jormungandr, is cast into the ocean where he grows to enormous size, and his other son, the Fenris Wolf, is too powerful for the Aesir to take head on, so instead they take him in to keep an eye on him, and he lives alongside them in Asgard for a while, even becoming close friends with Tyr. But as he grows bigger and stronger, the Aesir get more and more worried, and eventually come up with a scheme. Framing it as a game, they tie up Fenris with stronger and stronger chains, though they can't find anything that holds him for long. Eventually, they commission the dwarves for a chain made of impossible things, and ask Fenris if they can try it on him. But he's starting to get understandably suspicious, so he agrees on the condition that one of them put their hand in his jaws. If they betray him, they lose the hand. The Aesir are obviously reluctant, but Tyr agrees, and when Fenris can't break the chain and realizes the Aesir betrayed him, he bites off Tyr's hand. No word on how Loki felt about all this, but we can assume not great. There's another story where a disguised giant offers to build the Aesir a fortress, but as payment he wants the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freya. The Aesir agree.
Yeah, she didn't even know that all this was happening, and she got up, armpit off. God damn.
They want that fortress, but they also really don't want to pay for it, so they force Loki to sabotage the construction so the giant won't finish in time. Loki does this by turning into a mare and quote-unquote distracting the giant's horse, and when the giant realizes what's happening, he returns to his true giant form to file a formal complaint with his battle axe, at which point Thor kills him. Loki later gives birth to a healthy 8-legged foal, and that's how Odin got his faithful steed Sleipnir. And before we all judge Loki, let's consider who's more irresponsible, the guy who gives birth to a horse, or the guy who rides his nephew into battle. I'm just saying, I know which one I wouldn't trust as a babysitter. And as one more core world-building myth, Snorri recounts the events triggering Ragnarok, where Loki arranges for Baldur's death by mistletoe and flees from the angry Aesir, living in hiding and incidentally inventing the fishing net in his spare time. When the Aesir find him, he burns the net and turns into a salmon, hiding in a nearby waterfall, but one of the Aesir deduces his fishing net invention from the ash pattern and
Okay, so Aesir just means some kind of a group. So Thor is part of Aesir, huh? Because he did, suddenly Thor was there to kill the giant, so I guess Aesir means Thor. Aesir means, gods, Thor and Odin, I think, like that. So, oh yeah, that makes sense. So wait a minute. Aesir did all these things to this Loki's kids. One Loki pissed off because of that. I mean, they just, she just talked about how, they went to deal with the giant and things like that. But what about, they threw one off in the snow and another dog is chained.
recreates it, using the net to then capture him. Foiled by his own cleverness One final time, Loki is imprisoned under the earth and tortured by a snake, causing earthquakes whenever he wriggles. Now, there's a bunch of other stories about Loki: his wager with the sons of Ivaldi, his adventure with Thor dealing with Adgard Loki, and an interesting prequel to the Volsunga saga where he steals gold from a dwarf to repay a debt, including a cursed magic ring, and then passes the cursed ring off to the guy who forced him to pay the debt in the first place, kicking off a chain of murder and misfortune for the jerk in question, and leaving Loki consequence-free for a change. But basically, all the stories follow a very specific format. The Aesir make Loki fix a problem, whether or not he caused it, and Loki makes it work through a combination of cunning trickery, slapstick comedy, and the occasional pregnancy. But you also might notice that the Aesir don't really come across as all that good here. They break their oaths, cheat their way out of debts, torment and abuse Loki even on the rare occasion where the problem wasn't his fault. They're not painted as particularly divine. Snorri's retelling portrays the gods as flawed.
Yeah, but just like the Greek mythology, gods are not necessarily good in this context, isn't it? Yeah, isn't Loki true? What is called Aesir or whatever, the gods basically, with Odin and Thor. So yeah, I mean that's just effed up. What I don't understand is this Odin and Thor too, basically. Whatever whatever gods are there in Asgard, basically, took Loki's kids and thrown underworld and in the sea and chained off the dog. Then Loki got pissed off because of that.
Fallible and extremely human, which makes sense if he's trying to forge a historical cultural identity without getting too deep into the currently taboo religion that cultural identity is made from. And there's something kind of Christian about the way Loki is represented in this era, and not in the way you might expect. Beyond the prose Edda, this era also has the Poetic Edda, an anonymous compilation of poems collected around the same time. The Poetic Edda contains the Lokasenna, the flighting of Loki, an additional bit of detail from the precursor to Ragnarok where Loki calls out the Aesir on their failings and sins, and how they all like to heap blame on him when really they're just as bad as he is. At the end of that poem, they bind and imprison him, but they never really prove him wrong. Now, the portrayal of Loki in the Eddas kind of resonates with the biblical concept of the scapegoat. While nowadays that term means someone who's blamed for everything, in the Old Testament the scapegoat is part of a cleansing ritual. 2 goats are taken, one is sacrificed, and the other is driven into the wilderness. That one is the scapegoat, and it carries the sins of the people away with it, leaving them ritually purified of their failings at the cost of 2 goats. Christianity later added some Jesus flavoring to the scapegoat concept with the idea that Jesus himself is kind of a scapegoat for the sins of all of humanity. But unlike the goat, he does it on purpose as a willing agent, which is deliberately separating him from the scapegoat concept. But this portrayal of Loki kind of lines up with that. The Aesir do a lot of bad stuff, but then they turn around and blame Loki for it, or they make him fix it for them, absolving themselves of the consequences. Written 200 years post-Christianization, it wouldn't be too surprising if this biblical concept worked its way into Snorri's framing of this character, giving Loki a biblical context he wouldn't have originally had. And between his role as scapegoat and his torture and imprisonment for speaking a truth the Aesir didn't want to hear, it also has the wildly unexpected consequence of kind of making this version of Loki a Jesus figure.
Yeah.
Didn't see that.
Yeah, seriously, it is true, isn't it? Back portraying it as scapegoat, imprisoning because he speaks the truth. So this might be, Christian version of this. But, what if there is no original Loki? What if Christian came up with it in the first place? What if there is no Loki in the Norse mythology? I don't know. And if there was Loki in Norse mythology, maybe this part where, everybody blames him for that and he becomes some kind of scapegoat might be added, like she says. So, Loki's apparently Jesus-like figure, who would have thought?
That one coming. So since these Eddas already show some major structural hallmarks of Christianization, both the obvious with the Genesis stuff and the inobvious with the thematic parallels, we're once again stuck in a position where the only information we have about Loki is very untrustworthy. Go figure. Now, this isn't quite all we have from this era. Along with all the pillaging and burning, the Viking Age saw the creation of a lot of rune stones, carved rocks that don't tend to feature written mythology but frequently show images of some familiar stories. Mjolnir was a very common symbol on rune stones, and we have a handful of rune stones from between the 700s and the 1000s that show a few familiar sights: Odin capturing a salmon, a bound figure under a snake, a face with scarred lips, etc. While these still post-date the monk's arrival, they do show a figure whose role lines up with Loki's description in the Eddas, and they were carved at least a couple hundred years before Snorri got his hands on them. Although, fun fact, one of those theoretical Loki images shows a bound figure with horns and was carved on a cross. Once again, the Christianity is baked in. Still, while our knowledge is fragmentary and incomplete, this at least corroborates some of Snorri's stories. Now, there's some other fun stuff about Loki's character that we can glean from these Eddas.
Hold up there. So this is before Snorri wrote all this down, but this was still influenced by Christians?
Description in the Eddas, and they were carved at least a couple hundred years before Snorri got his hands on them. Although, fun fact, one of those theoretical Loki images shows a bound figure with horns and was carved on a cross. Once again, the Christianity is baked in.
Yeah.
Still, while our knowledge is fragmentary and incomplete, this at least corroborates some of Snorri's stories. Now, there's some other fun stuff about Loki's character that we can glean from these Eddas. The Poetic Edda mentions very briefly that at one point, Loki finds a half-burned heart of some unnamed evil woman, eats it, and becomes pregnant, later giving birth to the vaguely described evils that plague man. This story is never brought up anywhere else, and we have no idea whose heart it was or what evils it created, but this tiny 4-line anecdote puts Loki in the role of the folkloric mother of monsters, a non-uncommon motif ascribing all the evils of the world to some unlucky, usually lady, who initially gave birth to them or set them free. Gaia, Pandora, Echidna, Tiamat, Lilith, it's a theme that shows up sporadically all over the place. And speaking of themes, Loki has one more unexpected role. There's a very common Indo-European narrative of a prophecy, where someone, usually a king, learns a prophecy of their future doom at the hands of a child, usually a direct descendant or other close relative. The doomee responds poorly and imprisons the child, or their parent if the child isn't born yet, which inadvertently causes the child to later play out the exact role the prophecy foretold.
That's common, isn't it?
It happens with Oedipus, it happens with Balor and Lu, it happens with Perseus, it even happens with Krishna, and it happens with Odin, Loki, and Loki's kids. Since we tend to think of Loki as the bad guy, or at least the one to blame when things go wrong, it's easy to miss this, but Odin slots perfectly into the role of antagonist in that quintessential Proto-Indo-European prophecy structure. He hears the prophecy of Ragnarok.
Ooh, yeah, that is true, isn't it? I mean, Odin is the one who's threatened supposedly by Loki's kid, so that would make him antagonist. Damn, that is true. I mean, when it comes to Loki, isn't that weird? He's apparently a lot of mischiefs. He also get blamed for everything. Apparently gave birth to a horse, and then also gave birth to lots of evil because he ate a heart. How much things is this guy gonna do, man? Damn. It's complicated.
And in trying to forestall it, he inadvertently gives Loki's children the exact powers and motives they need to fulfill that prophecy. Hel had no power over the dead until she was exiled to their realm, and when Loki marches in Ragnarok, he brings her army of the dead with him. Jormungandr wasn't the world serpent until he was cast into the ocean, making him large enough to eventually kill Thor. And Fenriswolf was perfectly happy to live among the Aesir in peace with his best buddy Tyr until they betrayed him, and when he breaks those unbreakable chains, he kills Odin himself. And where does Loki fit in all this? Well, he's in good company with characters like Danae, Devaki, and Aethne, the unfortunate mothers to the prophecy children who are imprisoned, tormented, and otherwise live quite unhappy lives until their children reappear to fulfill the prophecy and kill their tormentor, which lines up uncomfortably well with the start of Ragnarok. The only thing making Loki unsympathetic in this situation is the fact that his prophecy children caused the literal apocalypse. But, and hear me out on this one, Snorri might not have intended to frame Ragnarok as a bad thing. Loki may be a backbiter and a trickster, but at this point in his development, he's in a surprisingly sympathetic role. He helps out more than he hurts, with the noteworthy exception of the death of Baldur and the onset of Ragnarok. But even that story is kinda suspicious. There are plenty of theories about it, but one of them suggests that Baldur's death is actually a ploy by Odin. Odin received a lot of human sacrifices, at least in the mythology, and he's sort of died a few times, sacrificing himself to himself for power and knowledge, and Baldur's death by mistletoe has some suspicious mythological resonances to other stories of sacrifices to Odin. There's a story about a legendary king, Vikar, whose ships are becalmed because Odin requires a blood sacrifice, and Vikar's name is drawn every time they draw lots. Vikar doesn't want to die, so his counselor assures him that they won't really kill him. They'll do the setup for the sacrifice, but instead of actually stabbing and hanging him, they'll use a harmless tree branch and like a really soft noose. But when they do, the branch suddenly turns into a spear and the king is really killed. Trying to fool Odin with a fake harmless sacrifice isn't very wise. So when Baldur is killed by a weapon made from a harmless little mistletoe branch, it lines up alarmingly well with this story of a tricksy sacrifice to Odin. And we gotta remember, Baldur doesn't stay dead. He comes back after Ragnarok, and Odin knows this because he knows the prophecies of Ragnarok. It's also noted in the text that nobody knows what Odin whispered in the dead Baldur's ear, but why would he whisper in a dead guy's ear at all? Baldur is killed in a way that closely resembles a sacrifice to Odin and comes back even better than before, something Odin famously did to himself to gain knowledge and power. And with all that for context, Loki's role in the death starts looking a lot weirder. And for that matter, Loki's relationship with Odin is a subject of academic debate. The Poetic Edda describes them as blood brothers, but some scholars suggest that Loki might actually be an aspect or a reflex of Odin, some offshoot deity playing a specific and unknown role. They are both tricksters and masters of disguise.
I mean, if it's just another version of Odin, that would make sense why Odin is constantly blaming him. But damn, that is something, isn't it? Loki is supposedly good guy in a way, because that prophecy thing where his kids kill this what are they called, the god's name, whatever, the gods basically, the Odin, Thor. So basically his kids kill them. They are the one who does all the bad thing and blame Loki for it. I mean, it does line up with all the other stories. And one guy that Loki killed, apparently, that's still was done by Odin.
And if I had to pick a Norse god to map to Mercury or Hermes, the trickster god and thief, I'd probably pick Loki instead of Odin. Baldur's death smells of lost mythological context and ritual implications. There's more going on here than we know, and that means Loki's role in the death is similarly mysterious. Anyway, this is unfortunately in the category of we'll probably never really know what was up with that, but it's still valuable information just to know that this story probably shouldn't be taken 100% at face value. Loki does a lot of dumb stuff, but casual god murder is a bit outside his regular wheelhouse. And here's another weird angle. Because of Snorri's authorial biases, his very conspicuous framing of the Norse gods in the strict past tense, and his extremely careful separation of these pagan myths from the Christian faith they've adopted, Loki killing Balder and triggering the twilight of the old gods might have been originally presented by Snorri as kind of a good thing. There's this biblical concept of cleansing Armageddon, that the world gets too messed up and sinful and your only option is to burn the bad stuff to the ground and start over. And while Ragnarok is almost certainly a pre-Christian concept, Ragnarok is a huge deal and the central focus of the narrative might have been a Christian modification. The idea that the old gods were messed up and had to die so a shiny new world could take over, with a shiny new Christian god in some translations, would have been very appealing for someone trying to appeal to a shared cultural history without superseding their shared religious identity. So what might have been a footnote or a highly contextualized ritual in the original folkloric space could have ballooned into being Loki's defining act, killing Balder and kicking off a cleansing apocalypse to make way for the new world. And again, as we've discussed, Odin has a lot of themes about dying and then being reborn even better. And it's another facet of Loki's character that's not nice, but from Snorri's perspective was probably still fundamentally good. All in all, the Eddas don't exactly paint a flattering portrait of Loki, but he still comes across as unconditionally necessary. He solves problems
so he might not be one of the likable type of characters. He might be look as some mischief character, but he was not inherently bad. I mean, he was still important, and he was more of a good-sided, I guess.
Else can handle. He gives the gods a scapegoat so they can maintain their own perceived flawlessness and never introspect enough to meaningfully improve, and he ends their imperfect world to make way for the new one. All good things from the perspective of someone living in that new world. So that's potentially Snorri's angle, though it's impossible to know for sure. But he's not the only Christian historian with an opinion on Loki. And amusingly, while the Eddas seem to frame him as a necessary nuisance, some of its later translators apparently missed the mark on that one, and interpreted Loki's role as trickster, deceiver, and father of lies as making him a Satan parallel, something Snorri himself never did. For instance, back in 1880, hilariously named Norwegian philologist Sophus Bugg theorized that all the stories in the Eddas were actually Christian, with basically no pre-existing mythological basis, and Loki was just literally Satan. And while that theory was soundly rejected by basically everyone, Loki as Satan wasn't so easily scrapped. It's not the most baseless analog. He's the token malevolent divinity, the god who betrays the other gods.
Even in the Marvel universe, he's I don't know how to say, he's never the devil character in the Marvel universe, is it? Even sometimes where it's shown, even he says it like he's misunderstood. So I guess whoever wrote this Marvel comics even knew this, I guess. That Loki is just misunderstood and it's not really that bad.
It's not that hard to parallel with a fallen angel or a Judas figure, except these interpretations hinge on his role in the death of Balder as the ultimate unforgivable betrayal, and completely ignore every other story about him. Some of these translations add prologues that refer to Loki as a vile serpent, which is totally made up. His only major epithets in the Edda are backbiter and Laufey's son, and he is never a snake. He and snakes don't really get along. If Snorri wanted to make Loki a Satan figure, he would have made him a Satan figure. But because Snorri put focus on Ragnarok for his own reasons, later analysts also focused on Ragnarok, and without the context Snorri had of cleansing the old world to make way for the one we live in now, it looks like a very bad thing, a tragedy, and it looks like it's all Loki's fault. With this perspective shift tipping Loki from necessary nuisance into fully antagonistic, Loki's complex and surprisingly sympathetic framing from the Eddas gives way to a much more basic one: cartoon Lucifer. He's still a liar and a trickster, but his role as problem solver.
Yeah, basically, Loki did all these things to make the world better. Even in the Hindu religion, there is another Vishnu avatar that's supposed to come in the future, Kalki. I think it's supposed to end the Kali Yuga, supposed to be bad time that we're living on right now, and gonna kill all the bad people or something like that. I don't know much detail, but something like that. So starting the world over is a theme in apparently all religions. So this is just like that. But I guess people just made Loki into this evil character because he supposedly end the world or something like that. But no. Damn, Loki's really misunderstood, isn't he?
withers away and gets replaced with some more satanic implications of being a manipulator and an evil tempter, which is hilarious because mythological Loki literally can't manipulate his way out of a box. But with Loki placed in explicit opposition to the Aesir, another possibility opens up, because the Aesir still don't come across as all that heroic. Violent, oath-breaking, perpetually drunk, it doesn't take much work to frame them as structurally problematic, especially if you add the subtextual implication that, on top of all their other flaws, they'd have to be idiots to keep someone like Loki around. But if the Aesir are bad, then Loki, their opposition, has the opportunity to be good. Loki makes an easy rebel against the system since he's basically just an agent of chaos.
Cool rebel. That does fit him. Is an anti-hero Loki. Yeah, that does make. That's more like Stone Cold Loki apparently. Much less common but fairly popular in modern writing. Corruption, immorality of the Aesir. Aesir are supposed to be gods, I guess. Odin, Thor, things like that. And from hearing all these things, looks like they were the bad people, not Loki. Is highlighted, providing moral justification for Loki. Sympathetic framing highlights his heroic qualities and day saving. Yeah, makes it. Yeah, he does lots of save, isn't it? They, these ACS do send him to do all the, saving thing, I guess, saving the day type of thing. Also focus on his torment by the Aesir. Yeah, that's also true. He speak out and they just bound him and, I guess, tormented him. Sometimes even killing Balder is framed as justified, even necessary. Yeah, like I said, even the, another avatar of Vishnu, just like how Krishna was, is supposed to end not end the world, but end bad part of the bad people and things like that. That is somewhat similar to the end of the world type of thing. And he's canonically pretty, so the fanfic kind of writes itself. Yeah, okay.
And with a little tweaking, he's not hard to rework into a misunderstood rebel anti-hero. Even post-Satanization, Loki still kinda walks the line between sympathetic and unsympathetic. Loki's character is fundamentally transgressive. He breaks rules and he crosses boundaries. He's pretty much the only Norse god who changes gender on the regular, and even his heritage crosses a line. A Jotun father and an Aesir mother, mixed parentage no one else seems to share. He travels a lot, accompanying Thor on the occasional journey, but more often borrowing Freya's feather cloak to travel to Jotunheim or to the realm of the dwarves. He doesn't fit easily into any one realm, and his divine domain is also a bit uncertain. That's a weird thing to overlook, right? He's a god, but why was he worshipped? Tyr and Odin, gods of war, were prayed and sacrificed to for victory in battle. Freya and Nord, gods of fertility, were sacrificed to for peace and a good year. Thor, god of storms and rain, was sacrificed to in times of famine or disease. But I can't find any big sacrifices to Loki or any agreement on what exactly he was the god of. Lies and trickery were his personality, not his deific domain. Thor wasn't the god of getting drunk and hitting stuff. The gods were worshipped because they played a role in the day-to-day lives of the Norse. What was Loki's? Unfortunately, it's really hard to tell. If he wasn't getting festivals or big dramatic blood sacrifices, it wasn't really going to be written down. Maybe he was worshipped in smaller, more domestic ways, maybe he was one of those antagonistic gods that people would pray against, but there's basically nothing to go on here. This is around the time where, with no other clues to go on, I'd want to dive into the etymology of his name to find out what he originally meant on the most basic level, or to see if he was based on an older god. But, unfortunately, that information doesn't really exist either. Loki's name is short and simple, and the etymology—
Yeah, but I feel like Loki didn't exist in the Norse mythology. I think Christians came up with it, I guess.
Etymology is a subject of furious debate. Due to its similarity to the Old Norse word logi, meaning fire, some people have suggested that he was a fire god. And while he might have been some sort of hearth spirit, more on that later, he doesn't seem to have been a fire god. The words are similar, but not cognitive.
If he was a fire god, then all the versions that we know of Loki is gonna be false. Trickster and all this thing he does. I mean, fire god, in any culture, fire is represented as some kind of a power and more dangerous. He wouldn't be just some god of mischief. He would be more like Thor, more dangerous and more revered, I guess.
Plus, in the myth of Adgard Loki, he loses an eating contest to Logi, the personification of fire. That wouldn't make any sense if they were supposed to be the same being.
Yeah.
So it's not Logi. What else could it be? Well, there's a few possibilities. It might be derived from the Proto-Germanic root luk, a root used for words related to loops, like knots, hooks, and locks. It also sees use in words for spiders and spider-related things. In Swedish and Faroese, the word for cobweb is literally Loki's net. So, is Loki a spider? While possible and delightfully creepy,
Crooked
that
makes
particular
more
spin
sense.
doesn't really have much evidence in the folklore. But Loki doesn't need to be a spider to have something to do with knots or nets. Loki's name could mean something a lot more basic, like entangler, which would fit pretty well with his mythical role of inventing the fishing net, which was then used to trap him. He entangles other people and himself in equal measure. This also makes sense if Loki is more like a title than a name. Utgard Loki, the illusionist giant faced by Loki and Thor, is very confusing on paper. He has no apparent relation to Loki, and they don't seem to know each other, but his name, Utgard Loki, means Loki of the Outyards. If Loki itself means entangling one, then the distinction makes more sense. Utgard Loki entangles them in illusions and impossible tasks, the entangler of the Outyards. If it's a catch-all term for tricksters and ensnarers, it would help explain why these otherwise unrelated characters share such a unique name. Loki's name has also survived in some folk phrases in Scandinavia, like mirages and other heat-based distortions are sometimes described as Loki sowing his oats or herding his goats. If the term has retained elements of trickery or illusion, it makes sense to use it in that context. But the folk customs can tell us more about him than just his name. Loki might not have gotten big feasts or dramatic society-wide sacrifice days, but elements of his nature seem to have lingered in the day-to-day folk customs, painting a rather more domestic picture. Some phrases describe Loki as responsible for heat hazes, sudden flares of a fire, cobwebs, and other kinds of ephemera, often attributed to small nature spirits called Vatir. Some other surviving Scandinavian traditions involve tossing a child's baby teeth into the hearth fire and asking Loki to watch over the kid. Particularly interesting, a lot of phrases and traditions about hearth fires and tending to them seem to work in a Loki reference. Now, this doesn't automatically mean that the Loki associated with the hearth has any relation to the god Loki. As we've already discussed with Adgard Loki, he wasn't the only Loki running around. But there's some pretty compelling evidence compiled in this essay that suggests that they're actually probably the same figure. And further, that the hearth spirit Loki might have been adapted later into medieval Norwegian folklore as an unlikely hero called the Ash Lad, a clever but lazy dude who tends the hearth all day until forced into a heroic adventure. If this is true, it suggests that Loki's divine role was as a mischievous but ultimately benevolent protector of the home and family, which honestly does resonate pretty plausibly with how many kids he canonically has. But unfortunately, like everything else about Loki, this is pretty confusing and hard to pin down.
Yeah, seriously, I mean, all the things that Loki is, that feels weird, man, isn't it? If that's actually true.
The connection is possible, but it's kind of impossible to conclusively prove. So where does that leave us? Loki has so many stories, but every single one of them has either a biased narrator, an incomplete narrative, or both. It's nearly impossible to find consistent threads. We don't know when he first showed up or what role he played in the society. We can't connect him to any precursor deities. We can barely even get a read on his personality. Loki is a mass of contradictions. And you know what? That's okay. This is one of many ways the gods can
Loki's mass of contradiction, isn't it? I feel like Loki didn't exist in the Norse god, just like, Odin, Thor. I think somebody came up with them afterwards, I guess. Christians or something. Because, all the Norse god is, I guess, solidified somewhat, like why they people pray to them, what other roles are. Loki is, I think, let's just say, way too much interesting to be real. That's what I'm thinking. I think Loki just came afterwards.
develop. They end up splintering over time. Usually the only gods with one perfectly consistent linear narrative are the ones who had that purposefully constructed by somebody with an agenda. But in a living mythology, a god is worshipped day to day. They play a role in a human life, and people's lives change, and so their needs change. The role a god plays can change a lot over time as the society changes. Without an artificially constructed coherent canon for Loki, we can't really get a good look at a linear narrative for him. But the fact that gods have linear narratives at all is usually an artificial addition from other people. Loki is extremely confusing, and that's okay. Nobody ever said he had to be simple. And the sad truth is that sometimes information gets lost.
Yeah, but there is pattern. If all gods are somewhat simple and less interesting, while Loki is not simple, really interesting, and nobody knows what people pray to him for, it feels like he's an odd thing out from all this Norse mythology. So, I'm still not believing that he might have been the original one. People just came up with him somewhere, I guess.
And once it's gone, we can never get the full picture. Trying to fill in the gaps with information that isn't there is a recipe for conspiracy theories. And to be honest, I don't think there's anything more quintessentially Loki than getting centuries worth of scholars at each other's throats trying to figure out his one true nature. Get a guy shapeshift in peace. Real quick before we go, we've got a brand new pin for you guys. And this one isn't a Greek god. You can snag this snazzy new Loki pin from our crowd-made shop for a limited time only. And it comes with this nifty sticker set. And I'm gonna say this in absolute seriousness. I think this is the greatest thing I've ever created. Okay, thanks, bye! I'm looking through you. Where did you go? I thought I...
Yeah. obviously Loki is very misunderstood. Loki is always portrayed as this trickster. I don't think people see him as the, I guess, devil type thing, even though that's how some people try to portray him, but still people still see him as evil, and that's clearly not the thing here. I guess that's the thing. When the gods themselves are somewhat bad, obviously opposing that party, that Loki, is gonna be looked as somehow bad. Even if the gods themselves are bad, Loki is just scapegoat, I guess. And obviously, if you like she said, if you follow all other mythologies around the world, and how there is an extinction event, and some entity's son apparently kills this evil thing, then that would make these gods, Thor, Odin, evil in some way. That kind of makes sense too. So yeah, I don't think Loki was evil. I guess he was complicated, and obviously he did all the basically he was a god of mischief, so obviously created lots of problems. But even the problem that he didn't create, those Thor, Odin, people like that, always send him to fix things. So that would make him good in some way, isn't it? He's fixing things. So yeah, that was really good take on Loki, I guess. This channel really dives deep, huh? I guess what is she called? Blue, I think. The girl here in this channel. She really goes into deep, isn't it? All the deep mythology. I love it. Alright, people. If you like my reaction, don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out the reaction. There's a link in the description. Check out the cast all playlist. Check out the end cards, and I'll see you next time.